So how do you get the most out of an image that may not be evenly exposed? In today's example, this is basically a typical interview scene. We have the subject, myself, and in the back, there is a window. That's really our highlights. And we're going to expose for the highlights to get that perfect image. So in today's video, I'm going to show you guys how to expose for highlights and get as much detail as possible in your image and really take advantage of the dynamic range in your camera. But we're also going to use our lights to make sure that we are also properly exposed. Let's dive in. Okay, so right now this is a typical image that you would probably see in an interview setting. You can see that I am pretty well exposed, and the window, although it's the greatest light source right now, it's pretty well tamed. I mean, I'm looking at my waveforms and there's nothing that is overexposed or blown out currently. There are so many things that you have to take into account, like your picture profile, what your camera is actually capable of doing, how much dynamic range it's rated for, your equipment, and the scene that you're trying to get and how to manipulate it. Okay, let's start off with your camera settings. You first have to start off with a picture profile that will give you the most dynamic range possible and really allow you to utilize your camera as best as you possibly can. Now, most log settings will give you the most dynamic range. I'm using the Sony a7S III. The Sony a7S III actually has a lot of picture profiles, and typically you want to be in some form of a log picture profile. I really love log 3. Log 3 is just a log profile that I'm very comfortable with. Now, I know people love to shoot also in log 2, and then you have things like D-log, which is usually a DJI thing, or even C-log or Canon log, which is a Canon thing. I'm not going to get into which log profile is the best log profile. That's not what this video is about, but choose whatever log profile that you're most comfortable with and that you like, and ultimately the log profile that your camera offers. So why log profiles? Well, a log profile will give you the most neutral image, but it's also going to retain a lot of details and allow you in post to manipulate the image as much as possible, both in color grading and in exposure. When you're editing, you want to make sure that you retained as much information as possible. And there's other things to consider, like are you in 8-bit or 10-bit, or are you shooting RAW? Typically that's going to retain a lot of detail, right? And of course your codecs. So there's a lot of different things to dive into, but try to shoot at the highest possible setting that you can. For example, the Sony a7S III right now, we're shooting in 10-bit and we're shooting in log 3. So that should give me a lot of detail to manipulate later. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and control my camera remotely, but let's go ahead and just, completely overblow the image right now. So the highlights I can see are clipping. First thing you got to do is let's turn off the lights, right? And let's just pretend that we're just setting up the image, for the first time. Take a look at your image and really review it. It's very clear that the window is the biggest light source right now currently. And we have to expose for the highlights, which is the window. All right, so I am going to bring down my ISO. And I'm also looking at my waveforms, but also look at the image itself and figure out where you feel most comfortable. So right there, I can see that the window is pretty well exposed. Sure, it's a little bit blown out. The sky is a little blown out because there's no clouds. And like I said, right now it is 12:21. So this is basically dead noon. The sun is, at the highest point. This is like maximum light. This is the worst case condition, right? So I'm pretty happy with that. I like what the image looks like so far. I'm definitely in the shadows and you can't see anything yet. We'll talk about the subject in just a bit. We also have a little light back here just to add, something to the image. Obviously, I'm not showing you guys like an actual interview setting. I'm just talking about exposure right now. Now, the next piece of advice that I have for you guys is try to manipulate that light source as much as possible, just like you would with any other lights, right? If you're just using lights, your own studio lights on a subject, you're going to manipulate it. You're going to add a softbox and things like that. Maybe we can add a curtain or something to diffuse the light. And I actually have one of those. So if we draw in this curtain here, you can see that that curtain has also really significantly improved the light source, right? We're now diffusing it, and it's also controlling the light a little bit better. Now, is it a flattering image? Not as flattering as before, because you can see more detail before, right? You can see the car parked out there and all that other stuff. But if this is all you have, right? Like, let's say, for example, the lights you have in studio are just not strong enough to properly expose the subject without, you know, overexposing the window, then maybe your best option is to try to control the window light and reduce some of that overexposure. So let's look at the image right now. All right, so if we add light to me, the subject, and I can already tell that I need to bump up the ISO a little bit. Okay, that's better. I am properly exposed. The window looks okay, it's diffused. So yeah, I can actually go down to 2.8 on my second camera and I'm still not clipping. So the window is a lot better. It's not as hard to control as it was with it wide open. And this is another option, right? Manipulating the light where you're overexposing, where you're clipping, and trying to reduce it as much as possible. And I'm really, really happy with this image. Now, let's remove the curtain for a bit and let's just look at what the image looks like. So removing the curtain, I can already see on the monitor that now we are slightly overexposed. We're clipping on the highlights. And camera 2 is overexposed. I can see on my waveforms that it is clipping slightly, but yeah, so it is what it is, right? So I either have to change my aperture or lower my ISO, or if I'm using NDs and I want to keep the aperture, you know, at 2.8 and try to get as much of that bokeh and, you know, separation from the background as possible, then I got to use an ND filter, right? And manipulate the light that way. So videography is always about manipulating light as much as possible, bouncing it, reflecting it, and using it to your advantage. Let's bring down the ISO a little bit. Right around there, that's okay. So the image is okay. I am not perfectly exposed, but it'll do. So for the settings that I have right now, for my camera settings, the dynamic range that's available in my camera, and the lights, more importantly, the equipment that I have, this is the best image that I can get right now. And if we look at camera 2, which is just to the right of me, you can see that the image is still very flattering. So if this was a 1-2 camera setup, the wide setup is retaining the most dynamic range, and it looks, you know, as good as we can get it for this particular scenario. And then camera 2, which is a little bit more of a close-up and the window's very present, is also retaining pretty good amount of detail. In this particular scenario, what would I do? Well, the light that I have, the key light, it's a very small, you know, Godox SL60 bicolor. If I were to swap that out for one of my main key lights, like my, I don't know, Zhiyun Mollis 300, for example, or my Godox VL 300, you know, those are much brighter lights with much bigger softboxes. I can definitely get a great image. But for the purpose of this video, I think I've illustrated, you know, my point. So to summarize, what did we learn today? Make sure that your camera settings are at the highest possible settings that you can get them for your specific camera. Make sure you're shooting in the highest, you know, color bit that you possibly can, whether that's 10-bit or even RAW, if you're comfortable with RAW. And then make sure you're shooting in a log profile, a neutral picture profile that's going to allow you to manipulate the image in more detail in post. Second, take a look at your image. Look at the light source. Look at where the highlights are overexposed and try to manipulate it as much as possible. Try to reduce it. Add diffusion if you can. After you looked at your image, try to expose for your highlights and get as much detail as possible. And then once you've manipulated it and really considered your scene and where you are overexposing, then expose for your subject. Turn on your lights and try to find that middle ground, right? The image that you want versus the image that you can get. If you're not getting the image that you want, then look at your equipment. Maybe if you have spare lights with you on a particular shoot, change out your key light, maybe add in a fill, reflect the light, bounce the light, do whatever you have to do to get your subject properly exposed. And if you can't ultimately do that, then you have to compromise with the image that you can get, and maybe think about getting stronger lights in the future, or I don't know, changing the image entirely, adding more diffusion, whatever it is that you got to do. And that's basically like an intermediate tutorial on how to properly expose and use the most out of your camera to get as much dynamic range as possible. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative, and if you did, please consider subscribing and joining our channel membership so we can continue making videos like this one. I'll catch you in the next video. Take care, everybody.